Welcome to the Law and Liberty podcast. I'm your host, James Patterson. Law and Liberty is an online magazine featuring serious commentary on law, policy, books, and culture, and formed by a commitment to a society of free and responsible people living under the rule of law. Law and Liberty in this podcast are published by Liberty Fund. Hello, and welcome to the Law and Liberty podcast. My name is James Patterson, contributing editor to Law and Liberty. With me today is Daniel J. Mahoney, professor emeritus at Assumption University, a senior fellow at the Claremont Institute, and a senior writer here at Law and Liberty. And he has written extensively on statesmanship, French political thought, the art of political thought of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, conservatism, religion, and politics, and various themes in political philosophy. His most recent books are The Conservative Foundations of the Liberal Order, The Other Solzhenitsyn, The Idol of Our Age, How Religion of Humanity Subverts Christianity, definitely one of my favorites, The Statesman as Thinker, and now, most recently, The Persistence of the Ideological Lie, The Totalitarian Impulse, Then and Now. Dr. Mahoney, welcome to the Law and Liberty podcast.
Oh, really happy to be here, James.
I can't believe those are starting just in 2011. You're a man of prolific writing. How do you do it?
Well, I've always been somebody who is convinced that thinking and writing go hand in hand. And so and I've always been an extremely avid reader. So from time to time, which is every couple of years, a theme comes upon me that needs to be addressed in a more thorough and systematic way. And I pursue that subject, or I often find myself already pursuing that subject. So I'm halfway done with a book when I realize this is a book. And the other thing is I like to write, and I think I'm a pretty good writer, so that makes a big difference. The writing has never been a terribly strenuous activity for me, and that helps a lot when you're the author of a fair amount of books.
That's right. And the subject in this one is the persistence of the ideological lie. For those who even know what that is, that's normally something we associate with communism, something in the past. So maybe explain what the ideological lie as a concept is and what it has to do with the present.
Yeah. One of the points I make in the book, and I've made quite emphatically, I think, since the 1990s, is we never really learned the fundamental lessons to be learned from the ideological tragedies of the last 2 centuries. So you might think of the period 1789 to 1989, 1991 as an age dominated increasingly by ideological threats to political civilization and the moral inheritance of the civilized world, the Western world. And I think there was a tendency first of all, so many intellectuals cheerleaded for these active efforts at moral and civilizational subservience. The first political pilgrim was Tom Paine. Now, Tom Paine wasn't a complete crazy by any means, but he suffered from a syndrome which we would see over 2 centuries, the pas d'ennemi à gauche, no enemies to the left. But he was a decent man, and he goes to France, and he ends up in a Jacobin prison because he thought it was an extreme measure to arrest and try and eventually execute the king and the queen and the royal children. He wanted them to come to Pennsylvania to be Republican farmers, and so we've always had intellectuals who thought that a more progressive and ideological version of modernity, what Eric Voegelin very suggestively has called modernity without restraint, would, sort of fulfill the promise of modernity and modern democracy. But if you look at the mainstream judgments about this ideological assault on civilization, you either had the cheerleaders who wanted democracy to become thoroughgoingly progressive, and as I say early on in the book, that was always linked to what Leo Strauss called the replacement of the perennial distinction between good and evil with the ideological distinction between progress and reaction. In other words, things were good because they were in accord with the logic of history, not because they were intrinsically meritorious or the opposite. All right, so we had these explanations. What was at stake in the age of totalitarianism? Collectivism, the planned economy, dictatorship versus democracy. There's an element of truth in all of that, but all of those explanations are superficial. And so when we come to the revolutions of 1989, the elite consensus was that this was simply the victory of a more efficient market order over a failed planned economy, or the victory of human rights over dictatorship. No one, or next to no one, really got to the core of what the ideological subversion of political civilization was, what thoroughgoing modernity without restraint was. And it meant, when I talk about the lie, which is a concept introduced by Solzhenitsyn and others, but very widespread among thinkers in the East, Havel, Benda, even some Boris Pasternak speaks about it, and Dr. Zhivago. Something much worse than dictatorship. It was the demand that human beings pretend to live in a surreal world where language had lost meaning, where facts were negated, where the distinctions between truth and falsehood and fact and fiction were essentially eliminated, and where people spoke, the French called it a langue de bois, a wooden language. The entirety of everyday life became permeated by lies. Not lies about this policy or lies about that, but fundamental lies about the nature of reality. So Eric Voegelin, who just happens to be better on totalitarianism than Leo Strauss. Leo Strauss' contribution to the understanding of totalitarianism, and it's a good contribution, is a interpretation of a dialogue by Xenophon, the hero. Well, that's a very indirect way of approaching the ideological lie. But Voegelin spoke about the forcible imposition of a second reality on the only human condition we know. And I think that here we're closer to the insights of Arendt in Origins of Totalitarianism, of Orwell in 1984. Of course, the great fear all these guys had was that, in Orwell's famous words, that the boot of such despotism could crush the human face forever. I don't think that was ever a danger. I don't think human nature can be fundamentally conquered once and for all, but it can be distorted, mutilated, suffocated. And I think we underestimated how long it would take for totalitarian regimes and societies to come out, to use Solzhenitsyn's phrase, from the rubble of totalitarianism. And we also underestimated the, and long and short of it, what was the dominant, or at least the an effort to make sense of the age of ideology and the West's eventual victory, which had less to do with our virtues and more to do with the intrinsic failures of totalitarianism. The major explanation was Francis Fukuyama's, and it was that he gave a Hegelio-Marxist interpretation. We were on the winning side of history, and history has now come to an end. And so, to quote Alexander Kojève, the Hegelio-Marxist bureaucrat and philosopher who first theorized the end of history in a Cold War context, the universal homogeneous state, the final form of government, the final form of society was liberal democracy. So it's kind of an inverted Marxism. We've arrived at the end of history, but it's not Marxist-Leninism, it's liberal democracy. Now, that was a very troubling and superficial analysis of events, but it showed as smart as Fukuyama was, and as smart as philosophically informed as his thesis was, it was just wrong in every respect.
So we end up with liberal democracy all the same, and yet we still have the ideological lie, which shows, as you were describing, is that the lie is not tied to a particular enterprise or government or even like a particular people or culture. Rather, it's almost like a temptation, and it seems to be an elite temptation to dominate with language. How does this emerge in Western liberal democracies after we're supposed to have learned the lesson from the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Berlin Wall?
I think our political and philosophical discourse is very confused. And I think it's confused in part because we continue to use words like liberalism and liberal democracy to describe a intellectual, political, cultural order that has remarkably self-radicalized over the last 10 to 50, 60 years. I'm an unrepentant defender, an advocate of liberal democracy, but not liberalism as redefined by progressives. And I think this is what all of us underestimated, the remarkable capacity and propensity of even a liberal order to self-radicalize. And that means, to adopt many of the tenets and traits and assumptions and presuppositions of the totalitarian enemy. I've already mentioned the growing replacement of this displacement of the perennial distinction between good and evil with the ideological distinction between progress and reaction.
Yeah.
You've entered a different moral and perhaps political universe when a liberal order is accompanied, informed by that kind of, democracy, as Pierre Menand has said over and over again, do you really have a representative regime or a liberal regime when democracy is redefined not to mean the self-government of a free or Republican people, but, the non-negotiable adherence to ever more extreme understandings of human autonomy? The paradox of late liberalism might be revealed in one of the mottos, the French soixante-huitard, the paradox of the New Left and an extreme form in France where the Fifth Republic was almost toppled was you had people on the one hand expressing political fealty, not to the Soviet Union, which seemed boring and bureaucratic, get excited about Leonid Brezhnev, this 3-pound apparatchik, but, so your attention was directed toward, Caribbean communism, Castro, or the beautiful Cultural Revolution and China. So you had these radical students. They were spoiled 21, 22-year-old bourgeois kids, privileged from, with the best upbringings in the world and freedom and free state educations, screaming and yelling about the need to bring Maoism and Castroism to France. And yet, what was their motto as they were behind the barricades and they were trying to destroy the liberal university? As, Raymond Aron pointed out at the time, it is forbidden to forbid. So imagine political totalitarianism with this extreme cultural and moral antinomianism. And, anything goes. And if you are in favor of maintaining an element of authority, not authoritarianism, but an element of authority, in the army, in the universities, in the churches, in the polity, you're an enemy of democracy. I think that's been the broad direction of the West. I mean, 1968 in France was an extreme version of it. I think 2020 in the United States was an extreme version of it, when you had, upper middle class people marching in the streets in support, not of the dignity of Black Americans, which is a noble cause, but in favor of a movement and a slogan dedicated to the proposition that America was an irredeemably racist nation, that the police shot 15,000 people a year, that people of color a year, that the police needed to be disbanded, which really means that the innocents, and vulnerable people in the inner cities and all that are left at the ravages of gangs and criminals, etc. And this is not a new phenomenon. As I show in the book, the Russian intelligentsia, educated society in Russia between 1860 and 1917 succumbed to this kind of madness. So, yes, it's an old problem, but it has resurfaced with particular virulence in recent years. And let me just add the final piece of the puzzle, and that is ideological Manichaeanism. And what do I mean by that? It seems to me moderate liberalism, conservatism, biblical religion, classical political philosophy all have in common, despite many theoretical differences, the view that human beings are imperfect, that wickedness cannot be expunged from the human condition, but only restricted within individuals and societies, that freedom needs to be accompanied by moral responsibility and self-limitation. And when that understanding comes under assault, and when, beginning with the Jacobins in the French Revolution, continued by the Marxists, continued by various, in the 20th century, we had these strange melanges, these mixtures of Freudian sexual emancipation with Marxist terrorism, with liberationist ideology, but it was always, we know who the evil people are. And they're evil less because of what they've done than because of who they are. And if you change the social system, if you get rid of those groups, classes, or races, the Nazis, of course, had the obsession with the Jews and had an essentially racialist ideology, but leftist totalitarianism has always been an ideological Manichaeanism centered around suspect classes or social categories. But I think what happened is after 1990, 91, because we didn't have a sufficiently vigorous analysis of what this age of ideology was about, there was never any challenge to either the facile distinction between progress or reaction and its accompaniment, the ideological Manichaeanism that saw guilt in certain groups of people simply because of who they are. They were ontologically guilty. And we had people like Shelby Steele in the late 80s and early 90s saying this will only increase in the form of American racialism. It'll only lead to a backlash where we're faced with real racism. When you tell young white men for 30, 40 years that they're ontologically guilty and the source of all evil in the world, some of them are going to fight back in very unsavory ways, without the dignity and restraint, let's say, of the religious believer. So, yeah, I think all those elements are there, but I think we have to go back to one of my opening remarks that the utter and complete failure to really understand the totalitarian tragedy allowed ideological Manichaeanism to resurge and to radicalize in ways that were perhaps as dangerous as the original forms of totalitarianism. And the disease was a disease within civil society. We've been very used to looking at totalitarianism and the state oppressing civil society. But what happens when the totalitarian impulse comes to dominate so many institutions within civil society, like universities?
Yeah, the problem really seems to surface in a conflation of issues that you mentioned, where we start with a principle of great moral importance, like racial justice, the establishment of due process and equal protection for Black Americans, which they had not had for a very long time under issues like Jim Crow, and conflating that to a very radical proposition about the 1619 Project, right? And the 1619 Project itself is tied up in this elite sort of civil discourse, started in universities. And the worst part is that the 1619 Project forecloses the possibility of reaching this very important moral outcome, almost dooms the whole project of racial reconciliation and racial justice by condemning the country. What on earth?
And condemning the dream. Remember Takosi Coates writing his book, Announcing the Dream. And the dream, of course, is what Martin Luther King had articulated in his speech on the Mall in 1973, living up to the promissory notes of the Constitution and Declaration. That became the enemy, the idea that the American proposition was in any way choice-worthy or noble or realizable.
What drives people to embrace the lie when it seems like it's such a vile thing to embrace? It seems very hard for me to imagine that one would want to believe that King is wrong about the dream, or that the Constitution and Declaration are bad. What is it that makes sort of elite liberal democratic people want to believe something so bad?
I think we should never underestimate the pleasures of self-loathing. Come fix your eye upon me. I thirst for accusation. I quote that from a 1925 poem by William Butler Yeats. And this has many fan manifestations. You've already mentioned the 1619 Project and the pleasure a large part of the intellectual class exhibits in believing and proclaiming that the United States is nothing but an irredeemably racist and oppressive and exploitative society. I also deal with it in my account of this really ubiquitous and mad settler colonial or post-colonial cult, which is so influential in the intellectual community, in the universities, of course. As I was finishing up the book, I saw that Taylor Swift was giving a concert, and you didn't think I'd mention Taylor Swift in this interview.
No, that is definitely not on the bingo card.
Taylor Swift was doing a concert outside Toronto, and she just ritualistically apologized for being on occupied land. And it's if she was on occupied land and thought it was a massive injustice, she shouldn't be doing a concert there,
That's right.
But the moral preening and the lack of historical perspective, the transformation of all original peoples, who, of course, probably viciously replaced another people. That's how, unfortunately, the world often works. But yes, there's a view that is inculcated into the young in elementary schools and high schools that is deepened in a kind of ritualistically ideological way at the college or university level that tells people that the freest, most prosperous, and self-critical countries and civilization in the world is the most irredeemably evil. And I cannot help but think that there's a certain perverse pleasure in people knowing we hold the monopoly on evil in the world, and we're part of this small intellectual elite that recognizes this. I would also not underestimate the role of cheap grace. All the moral preening of the intellectual class is, in a way, a plea to make an exception of them. In other words, woke, white, progressive intellectuals are supposed to get a pass. They, of course, occasionally have to engage in these ritualistic moments of self-criticism, public browbeating. We see this more and more with mainstream publishing. But in a way, they're hoping that they will be exempted from cancel culture. And I don't believe, by the way, that wokeness or cancel culture has gone away. I think it's being contested, being very strongly, maybe not always wisely, but very strongly contested by the present administration. And it's being contested increasingly by people who were fighting back. That wasn't so much the case, let's say, in 2020. But yeah, I think there's all that going on. And in other words, I think we have to recur to one of the categories that was very influential during the Cold War when anti-totalitarian thinkers and intellectuals tried to make sense of why so many people in the intellectual class were attracted to political and ideological movements that destroyed intellectual freedom. The so-called captive mind that Shewa Miłosz spoke about in his famous book from 1953. And I think there are strange pleasures associated with the self-enslavement of the mind. Why, for example, would Black progressives and white woke intellectuals be so attracted to a position that says to Black Americans and other minorities, so-called people of color, that you have no agency whatsoever? I mean, if you read the 1619 Project closely, the book, which I treat in a chapter of The Persistence of the Ideological Lie, its authors say over and over again that nothing can ever change in America, and nothing has ever changed in America because people have no freedom. They not only don't have political freedom or civil rights, they have no metaphysical freedom. They have no free will. And somehow telling people of color that you're playthings of an evil system and that will never, ever, ever change. It's demeaning. It encourages deep-seated nihilism. But and that's part of it, I guess, this strange mixture of a distant call to emancipation and revolution with a hopelessness and a nihilism that the existing order is beyond redemption. And, this isn't most people look up and say, this isn't the world I'm living in. But yeah, I mean, it's very, you ask a really wonderful question, which is, it's hard to unpack the deep human motives that would lead, very intelligent people to adopt an ideology that denies the freedom of the mind and that denies any attachment to a decent political order. So I do think the lie has its attractions, but I think we shouldn't underestimate the capacity of intellectuals toward self-destructive thinking. And there's a difference between an intellectual, by the way, and a real philosopher, a political philosopher. They're caught up by the winds. They're caught up. I go back to Vogelin. There's spiritual, we called it pneumopathology. There's spiritual illness here. I'm not talking about mental illness. I'm not talking about people, repeating what the communists did and putting political opponents in psychiatric institutes. But I'm talking about sickness of soul.
Yeah.
And some people seem to admire, this was particularly true on the Nazi or fascist right, but I think it's also true with those who indulge communist movements. There's a strange admiration for violence, for the joy of the knife, as Nietzsche put it. And by the way, I think American conservatives have to get over the habit of just saying, oh, this is liberalism, none of this stuff is really, decayed liberalism is a very important part of the story, but we've left liberalism behind. These are post-liberal and anti-liberal currents, deeply destructive of liberal democracy, rightly understood. But liberalism's part of the story because liberals haven't been admirable or energetic in defending authentic liberty against these nihilistic challenges. So anyway, we could go on and on this particular topic, but I will show minimal self-limitation.
That's right. Well, the word that you use towards the end of the book that I think is a word that does not get enough play. I know Aurelian Kritu has written on this subject, but that's the subject of moderation. This is a virtue that gets little play today. And I think it's at the heart of a lot of the problems you were just describing, where there's this immoderate tendency among politics, right? But starting with this kind of revolutionary cause on the left that wishes to impose the second reality, and then this provocation of a post-liberal or an illiberal right that seeks to almost sort of nihilistically inhibit that project. There seems to be nothing creative. There seems to be nothing genuinely good, and that starts with this desire to do harm. But also it shows a lack of moderation about the one's ideas about what politics can even do.
Yeah, I think that's right. Mostly the post-liberal, anti-liberal tendencies on the right you've just spoke about are mainly, I want to say it's a marginalized phenomenon in America, but it's often an internet phenomena.
Definitely.
So I don't think it's taken the form of a political. Clearly, there's some people in MAGA who are on the edge of this stuff, but mainly people like you and I pay more attention to these movements because we find them intellectually troubling, even if they're not household currents or household names. Yeah, I mean, part of the problem about, and moderation is a fundamental political virtue. One different disagreement I have with Aurelian Kritu, you may have seen I wrote a review essay on moderation and conservatism for the fall 2024 issue of Modern Age. And I reviewed very sympathetically Aurelian's recent book, Letter to Young Moderates. And
it's almost like I planned this question.
and John Keeks, the Hungarian emigre, well, it must be close to 90 now, very intelligent, analytic political philosopher, wrote a book in defense of moderate conservatism. I do take Aurelian to task a bit in my review because I think he has a tendency to confuse moderation with geographical centrism. And I think the spectrum has moved so far that things that are highly questionable from the point of view of authentic moderation have become part and parcel of what moderates consider to be moderation. Let's say abortion on demand, or let's say a fundamental change to the nature of marriage. Marriage, when you separate marriage from any link to human nature, that's a revolutionary act. You're not expanding marriage to people who've been left out. You're redefining marriage as simply a contract with no basis in human nature. That's hardly moderate. Now, we could debate it and disagree about it or whatever, but there are many other examples like that. I mean, most soi-disant moderates today consider abortion on demand to be an accomplishment of late liberal society. Many people who call themselves moderates were very hesitant to challenge trans ideology and stuff like that. These are radical innovations. And then, 73 genders. Boy, that's a long way from God created the male and female, or, the so-called sexual binary. So I mention all of this, and a lot of soi-disant moderates are very good at pointing out the threats of autocracy or some of the dangers with populism. I think they generally tend to see more overt hostility to political democracy in most populist movements that are there. But there's a very heightened awareness of right-wing populism or authoritarianism, but are a little tepid in standing up to wokeness. In other words, it's a certain kind of moderation can go hand in hand with, I don't want to say the aggressive pas d'enemy à gauche, but with a sort of moderate version of that,
Yeah.
So I am a partisan of moderation as one of the four cardinal virtues and essential to decent politics. But I am also reminded Burke in the 1790s, when fighting certain British liberals who were blind to the menace of Jacobinism, said, we don't need a full, and all Burke did was talk about moderation his entire political career and prudence. But he said, don't confuse it with a false reptile prudence, a kind of a prudence that is so prudent that it doesn't see what's before him. And again, there's room for reasonable disagreement on what's the most pressing threat at the present moment and all of that. But I do warn in principle that moderation should not mean a slightly slower accommodation to what is perceived as inevitable.
There's that, our preoccupation with post-liberal, illiberal currents and the right actually draws a lot of its energy from that process of a conservative saying, well, I'm against left issue X, and then there's the conservative case for left issue X, and then there's beyond the left issue X wars, right? And so it's that I will put up no fight, and when I lose, I will accept the terms of the opponent, and
that's why a lot of populists have turned against so-called liberalism in a virulent way, because they associate it with a lack of principle and a lack of spirit. And they're not altogether wrong. But on the other hand, I think you and I, in our different ways, were quite alarmed that by the willingness of some people who we were close to at one point, or still remain close to, who just were willing to throw out, to proclaim with a certain alacrity, the founding has failed, or, liberalism to core has failed. I think, and I've always thought, that part of what we're defending, what we conservatives are defending, is liberalism. I agree with Sir Roger Scruton, who was a major influence on my own thinking and writing, that one thing conservatism does is it saves liberalism from itself.
Yeah.
In other words, there are many liberal goods, but the liberals don't know how to defend them for many of the reasons that we've talked about today. And so I don't reduce conservatism to liberalism. I think that would be folly. And I don't reduce the American Republic to liberalism, even though there's powerful liberal elements. But, any viable conservatism in the modern world, truly anti-ideological, anti-totalitarian, will be a liberal conservatism. It will safeguard what's best in liberal civilization without giving in to the ideological temptation. Or one reason I subtitled my book The Totalitarian Impulse. I do think the rhetoric of a totalitarian temptation is a meaningful and necessary one, but I don't want to fall into the trap of saying we're living in a totalitarian country. We're not.
Right.
But the totalitarian impulse is alive and well. Those are two different statements and two different recognitions.
So you earlier mentioned that you don't think this totalitarian impulse and things like wokeness or other terms like that, especially after the new administration took over, it's really on the decline so much as it's almost maybe like retrenching. And so what is it that you see as necessary in order to constantly keep it at bay or even further push it back? What is it maybe about the present reforms to government or what have you that have seen maybe its decline, at least in the short term?
Look, I know people can disagree with this, like let's say how one judges or approaches something like Doge. But I do think it's been an American form of glasnost to know, some of the stuff that, let's say, I think a once very useful and admirable institution like USAID was funding. There was a lot of stuff that was highly questionable, that was promoting an extremely progressivist view of democracy and of human nature and of sexuality, and doing so globally in an aggressive way. And I do think the federal government, at least for a time, this is all executive orders can be reversed by other executive orders. We have to remember. But yes, breaking, I have always thought of wokeness and the totalitarian impulse in late modern societies as a phenomenon that primarily exists within, a self-enslaving civil society. But I think under the last administrations, it had some help from the federal government. So to break that nexus is an important development. But I think it's also the case that woke modes of thinking and acting are deeply ingrained in higher education, deeply ingrained in the intellectual community, deeply ingrained in the entertainment community, deeply ingrained in parts of social media. And they're not going away. These modes of thinking are not going away. In November of 2024, if you read the center-right media, there was a ton of foolish stuff written, like woke is over. It's all over. It's all collapsed. And I was thinking to myself, what's changed? An election. But elections make a difference. But I think there was a certain giddiness in elements of the right that, and I think maybe that giddiness is linked to the fact they don't know the intellectual and academic worlds like we do.
That's right.
These were people who were very slow. I went to a Roman Catholic, a Jesuit college between 78 and 82, where the chaplain was writing paeans to Maoist China and saying the kingdom of God was alive in Cuba. When Alger Hiss came to my college campus in 1979 or 1980, I was the only one in an audience of 500 who got up and challenged him, because I had read Witness and I had read Alan Weinstein and Sidney Hook on the case, and I knew how fraudulent Hiss was. But this stuff's been going on for a long, long, long time, and conservatives didn't notice. There was some talk about PC, but why did they notice? Because they were too economistic. They confused winning elections with winning the culture. They were blind. They were anti-intellectual to some extent. And how many times did we hear the mantra, well, they'll graduate and go into the real world?
Oh, my goodness. Yeah.
Well, in the summer of 2020, the New York Times newsroom was the real world. These people who had graduated with highly tendentious, ideologized educations. America's the root of all evil. Western civilization is intrinsically guilty. Some narrative about colonialism being the equivalent of the Holocaust, an antinomian sexual morality, a deep and growing distrust for freedom of speech. Biggest change in my lifetime as a professor and writer has been the collapse of the American consensus in favor of free speech. We used to argue about pornography, or maybe, out and out totalitarian organizations in the 50s, whether they had a right to exist. But about political speech, there was a real consensus in this country, and that is gone. I would say the other consensus that has broken is a consensus in favor of Zionism and the state of Israel. But that's broken on the left and in a few quarters of the internet right. But anyway, Americans on the center right were very slow. David Ackman cuts off his money for the University of Pennsylvania, but this stuff had been going on at Penn for 40 years. I think it was 5-7 years ago. I remember seeing a story. There was this big, ritualistic event to the Department of English at the University of Pennsylvania. They all got together and they put a towel over a portrait of William Shakespeare. They were, made him a non-person. Shakespeare ought to be at the center of any. No wonder no one majors in English anymore. People who want to read real books want to learn about the human condition. They want self-knowledge. They want to learn the richness that literature has to offer the soul. They're not there to hear, the same speech about settler colonialism day after day. And so they walk with their feet. And notice the lefties and the pomos blame it on the market. Well, it is the market because people are voting with their feet and their bucks. But they wouldn't be voting that way if the humanities departments actually talked in a serious way, in an inviting way about the great and enduring and permanent questions.
That is one of the most frustrating aspects of dealing with this as a cultural phenomenon, where a lot of people who are conservatives have supported traditional universities, especially elite universities. Maybe they've pulled their money from those universities, but where did they put it? And they could be funding more traditional curriculum at other universities or starting centers that do that kind of university work. And instead, there seems to be this kind of, well, the market will sort this out, as you said, this kind of economist's view. And it's what this underestimates, and I think we've seen this with a lot of the exposure of the grant money that goes to places like Columbia, is that there's a very large amount of money that subsidizes the bad behavior in these departments that they're not going to be able to influence just by pulling their own money.
No, I think in this sense, the alum or critical of the movement toward intellectual authoritarianism and wokeness in universities, they have to think much more creatively.
Mm-hmm.
They probably, in many cases, they have to make breaks with the universities for whom they look. Everyone has an attachment to, the friends and deeds and misdeeds they did between 18 and 22. It's a formative part of life. You don't want to remember.
No comment.
You don't want to remember all the drunken evenings and misdeeds, but to sort of say, look, that's not all that important now, given what's happening in the country, that there are promising institutions and initiatives that are going to do a much better job of promoting and supporting and sustaining the things I care about. I think that's going to take some education. Way back in the 70s and 80s with groups like IEA, Irving Kristol tried to do that, advising conservative-minded philanthropists where to spend their money and not waste it on institutions that were no longer committed to their founding purposes. And I think more of that is happening, but it's still a little too ad hoc. Mm-hmm. Jay, let me just add one more thing so we don't leave it out of the conversation.
Yes.
One thing I do talk about in the book, and that has fascinated me recent years, is the resurgence of positive interest and evaluations of communist regimes among the young and among scholars too. It really, I think most of us thought by the mid-90s that the allure of communism had been buried, but not really. I mean, there are many young people who don't know anything resembling the fundamental facts about communist totalitarianism in the 20th century. And it's really frightening. A friend of mine who is much more technologically capable than me showed me these Reddit pages that are dedicated to mainly 20-somethings praising North Korea. Everything that the West says about North Korea is propaganda. North Korea is a progressive society. The Kims haven't killed anyone. It's a society dedicated to social justice, fighting American imperialism. How many years did we hear about the beautiful medical system in Cuba? The electric grid has collapsed in Cuba. Those hospitals were always prestige projects in Havana for the foreign visitors and the party elite. 93% of Cubans live in abject poverty. 1 million Cubans have left in the last year and a half, on top of the millions who had left before. I had a student at Assumption University before I retired who, when reading about the persecution of religion in totalitarian societies, said, I didn't know communism was hostile to Christianity. You know, and these might sound like anecdotes, but there are, in the literature, in the academic literature, there's a growing tendency to normalize Lenin and Stalin and Mao in a way one would never normalize Hitler. So that is deeply concerning. I say somewhere in the book that I used to hear from students, communism was good in theory, but bad in practice. And now I hear from them, it's good in theory and not so bad in practice. You know, my little chapter on Marx, where I say, good in theory. Second part of the Communist Manifesto, the 4 abolitions: property, family, religion, and the nation. Is that a good theory? Is that based on a real knowledge of the workings of human nature? And add to that, Marx saying, I will address no questions. I will refuse to respond to any objections to communism made in the name of religion, philosophy, or natural justice. That gets to the heart of the ideological lie. The Socratic questions, the natural interrogation, the what is questions, what is justice, what's the good, have to be shut down. And yet we have intellectuals and young people telling us this is some kind of admirable ideal. And by the way, we do have a few nuts on the right who think, Nazism wasn't so bad. And that's, yeah. Do you remember when Ross Stout had said some years ago to some New York Times readers, you go at the religious right, wait till you face a really pagan or atheistic right.
Yeah, we faced it before, and it wasn't very good.
Wasn't, as we like to say, it wasn't pretty.
No, it wasn't. And there's something sort of terrifying about the prospect of, the kind of rehabilitation of communist regimes that invites that same kind of rehabilitation of fascist and Nazi ideas where, well, if we're going to engage in intellectual malpractice on the left, well, why don't we do the same because it's working for them? And there's this kind of arms race to extremes and damn the facts.
At the end of the book, when I have this final word to the left, right, and center, and I kind of warn about some of the pagan temptations on the new right, I say about opposing the totalitarian impulse, resist but do not emulate. Yeah. Now, that of course, when one fights, one sometimes has to use neutral weapons, but emulation means adopting, this cult of Carl Schmitt, for example, making enmity the fundamental truth of the human condition. No. I mean, to fight the totalitarian foes of civilization is not to establish a political order where struggle or enmity is the moral basis of civic and political life. Quite to the contrary.
The book is The Persistence of the Ideological Lie, the Totalitarian Impulse Then and Now. The author, the one and only Daniel J. Mahoney. Dr. Mahoney, thank you for appearing on the Law and Liberty podcast.
Well, great fun, James.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Law and Liberty Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and visit us online at www.lawliberty.org.